A racist couple thought they could break Big Shaq by destroying his home. But they didn't know. This house carried more than bricks and memories. It held legacy, power, and purpose. What started with hate turned into a story the whole town would never forget. When Big Shaq chose grace over revenge, the reckoning hit harder than any retaliation. What unfolds next? Not just justice, transformation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Willow Ridge was the kind of place that stayed still, even when the world outside was burning. The lawns were manicured, the shutters always white, and the neighborhood watch meetings were more like curated performances than genuine gatherings. This wasn't a town that welcomed change. It tolerated it, like a bitter pill swallowed only when no other option remained. And on a clear-skied Thursday morning, change pulled into the driveway of 1112 Hollow Creek Lane in the form of a matte black pickup truck, and out stepped a man whose presence echoed louder than any siren. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq. But this wasn't the towering figure from highlight reels and late-night interviews. This was a different Shaq, a quiet Shaq, a man no longer chasing crowds, but seeking corners, spaces carved out for healing, for honoring what once mattered. The house he'd bought was nothing like the mansions he'd been offered. It had chipping paint, a sagging porch swing, and a creaky gate that made more noise than it should. But it had one thing no other property did: history. This was once the home of Coach Bradley, the man who first told him, "You don't just play the game, son, you lift the whole court." Coach Bradley had died 2 years ago, alone and nearly forgotten. No children, no plaque, just memories and boxes of VHS tapes. No one watched anymore. The house had been on the market for over 8 months. No one in Willow Ridge wanted to live in a legacy property tied to a man who'd coached mostly black athletes, at a time the town preferred to pretend never happened. But Shaq had been watching, and when he signed the deed, he did it with a kind of reverence, like he was stepping into a sacred space. The first day he worked alone. No moving crew, no noise, just him and a wrench, tightening bolts on the mailbox that leaned like it was tired of standing. He wore jeans, an old t-shirt, and a navy cap pulled low. Anyone looking wouldn't have seen a millionaire or a celebrity, just a man in his 50s, bent at the knees, wiping sweat from his brow. But they were looking. From behind their window shades, from driveways with "Back the Blue" signs staked into the flower beds, they watched. Across the street, the Wilburns stared harder than most. Grant Wilburn leaned on the hood of his silver convertible, arms crossed, lips curled into something like a smile, but not quite. His wife Delilah stood next to him, her pastel cardigan too bright for her expression. They didn't wave, they didn't speak, but their silence was thick enough to hear. Shaq noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't flinch. He raised his hand casually in greeting. Not too eager, not too passive, just enough. Delilah blinked. Grant didn't move. Then they turned, walking back inside their home, like nothing had happened. By noon, Shaq had unrolled blueprints on the hood of his truck. Not architectural ones, emotional ones. Plans to repair floorboards, patch drywall, repaint rooms in colors that felt like memory. He knew which room would be the study, which one would become the library. He'd already ordered vintage basketballs to place on the shelves, the same kind Coach Bradley used during drills in the '80s. He made 3 trips to the hardware store that day. The second time, the young clerk didn't recognize him, just rang up his paint cans and asked, "You moving into that old place on Hollow Creek?" Shaq nodded. The kid smirked. Not malicious, just misinformed. Not a lot of folks stick around long there. Shaq paused, then replied, "I plan to." That was all. No speeches. Just intent wrapped in certainty. The sun sank lower that afternoon, stretching long shadows across the picket fences. Kids rode scooters, but didn't slow down near Shaq's lawn. Their parents watched from porches, murmuring. Willow Ridge wasn't used to being surprised. And Big Shaq, quietly setting up a porch light, was a seismic shift they hadn't anticipated. Inside the house, dust motes danced in the light. The living room smelled like cedar and ghost stories. On the mantel, an old photo of Coach Bradley still stood. Shaq had found it wrapped in yellowed newspaper. He cleaned the glass with a soft cloth and set it back carefully, as if disturbing it too quickly might wake something. By the second day, the whispers had turned into waves. A woman walking her golden retriever slowed by his driveway and said, "That house has a lot of history." Her tone was polite, but Shaq replied, "That's why I bought it." She didn't know how to respond. He didn't wait for one. Later, a group of neighbors gathered near the corner mailbox. Casual gathering on the surface. Lawn chairs, coffee mugs, small talk. But every few minutes, eyes darted to the house. One man pointed, another laughed. Delilah Wilburn was there, wearing pearls at 3 in the afternoon. She sipped her tea without smiling. But Shaq didn't entertain paranoia. He worked. He spent that week in the backyard, planting a lemon tree. Coach Bradley used to say, "Grow something, even if it's just hope." And Shaq wasn't here to just occupy. He was here to root. That night, as he turned off the porch light, he noticed something on the edge of his property line. Small, almost unnoticeable. A smear of black on the white wood of the fence. He walked over. Spray paint. Faint but intentional. Not your kind. He stared at it. Long and quiet. Then he turned, walked inside, returned with sandpaper, and scrubbed it clean. The next morning, a neighborhood newsletter was left in his mailbox. The kind printed on glossy paper with smiling faces on the cover. Inside, a letter from the HOA president welcomed Shaquille O'Neal to our proud and peaceful community, and reminded all residents that external modifications to homes should be pre-approved for aesthetic cohesion. A passive note. Not an outright warning, but close. He read it once, folded it, and placed it beside Coach Bradley's photo. 3 days later, someone knocked on his door. It was the Wilburns. Grant smiled like a man used to being liked. "Thought we'd stop by and say hi properly this time." Shaq opened the screen door, nodded. "Afternoon." Delilah looked around the living room. "It's quaint," she said, her eyes scanning the furniture that hadn't been updated in decades. "You planning on gutting it?" Shaq shook his head. "Restoring it." Grant laughed lightly. "Interesting choice. Most people would tear this place down." "Most people ain't me," Shaq said, not cold, just factual. There was a beat. A silence shaped like tension. "Well," Grant said, clearing his throat, "we're across the street if you need anything. Just neighbors looking out, you know." Shaq looked at him evenly. "That's good to know." They left after that, not hurried, but not lingering either. And when the door closed, Shaq sat on the old recliner Coach Bradley once used. He didn't feel threatened, not yet, but he felt something, a shifting undercurrent. Willow Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a test, and Shaq didn't fear tests. He'd been tested all his life, on courts, in boardrooms, in places where his size spoke before his name did. But here, the test wasn't about strength. It was about stillness. About whether his peace could hold against their pressure. That night he called his mother. Lucille didn't ask if he was safe. She asked if he was being watched. "Some," he said. "Good," she replied. "Let them. Just make sure they see the man, not the myth." He looked out the window. Across the street, Delilah stood behind her curtain. "Don't worry," he said softly, "they will." And outside, the lemon tree caught the moonlight like it was made of silver. Something was growing, quietly, stubbornly. Roots were taking hold in the soil of a town that didn't know how to welcome them. And Big Shaq wasn't going anywhere. On a Tuesday morning, as Shaq was digging a trench for a new pipe, a woman approached with a peach cobbler in hand, and the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Marlene," she said sweetly. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Thought you might like something home-baked." Shaq wiped his hands on a rag, nodded politely. "Appreciate it." She lingered, looking past him into the house. "You really doing all this yourself?" "I am," he replied. "That's admirable," she said, hesitating just enough to sour the word. "Most folks don't usually stay long in that house." "Strange history, you know?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" "Oh, nothing spooky," she said quickly. Too quickly. Well, let's just say not everyone finds what they're looking for here." He thanked her again, but as she walked away, her words stuck like a splinter. He didn't know what she meant. Not exactly, but he recognized the tone. It was that familiar mixture of caution, dressed as kindness, curiosity laced with warning. The next to arrive were the Wilburns. They didn't knock this time. Instead, they appeared at the edge of the driveway, while Shaq was repainting the window frames. Grant wore a polo shirt tucked too tightly into khakis. Delilah's blouse was pressed like she was going to church. "You really are doing it all solo," Grant said with a grin, eyes squinting under the sun. "Didn't think someone of your stature would be so hands-on." Shaq climbed down the ladder slowly. meeting them halfway. I like building things, he said simply. Delilah tilted her head, as if trying to read him. You know it's unusual. Someone like you choosing this street. Someone like me? Shaq asked. Not confrontational, just curious. Oh, I just mean, well, you're famous, she replied quickly. You could live anywhere. Shaq gave a small, knowing smile. I like this place. They stood in awkward silence. Grant kicked at a pebble. If you ever need help with permits or contractors, I know a few people in the city. Real clean work. I'm good for now, Shaq said, picking up his paintbrush. Delilah looked at the front porch light, freshly rewired. Just hope you're not overextending yourself. This house takes a lot. She's got bones, but not the good kind. Shaq looked up at the gable. Old bones can still stand, if you treat them right. That was the end of it. They walked off, waving over their shoulders like it was all friendly. But Shaq knew the difference between welcome and tolerance. What they offered wasn't friendship. It was a test, and he had no intention of failing it. The next few days passed with more strange smiles. A man in a jogging suit who paused his morning run to ask, So, what brings you to Hollow Creek? A woman walking a bouchon frisé who said, That house is lucky to have someone like you, and then added, Do you plan to bring family over often? The questions weren't questions, they were check-ins, measurements, adjustments. Every compliment had a hook. Then the incidents began. It started small. A flathead screwdriver went missing from his tool belt. He figured he'd dropped it, maybe left it in the yard. But by the end of the week, 3 tools were gone. A level, a socket wrench, and a paint scraper. All too specific to be accidental. He didn't call the police. What would he even say? Then came the paint. One morning, Shaq found his 2 sealed cans overturned on the front walkway, a thick river of deep navy streaking down the path like bruised water. The lids were off, but not dented, not dropped, deliberately unscrewed. He stood there a long time, looking at the mess. Then he turned back into the house, grabbed gloves, and began the slow work of cleaning it up. Neighbors watched from porches and driveways. No one said a word. He didn't expect them to. The worst came that Saturday. Shaq was trimming hedges near the backyard when he heard the sound, light, thudding, almost like a whimper. He followed it to the garden shed, heart already tightening with unease. Lying just inside the doorway was a cat, still, lifeless. No collar, but he recognized it. A white tabby that often lounged on the Wilburns' front steps. It didn't look hurt. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just dead. Shaq called animal control, who arrived quietly. No sirens. The officer, a young woman with sharp eyes, took notes and lifted the cat gently. Know who this belonged to? She asked. Think it's the Wilburns, Shaq said. She nodded, grim. Doesn't look poisoned or attacked. Might have eaten something. Could have wandered. Could have, Shaq repeated, but he didn't believe it. Word spread fast. Delilah appeared on his doorstep within the hour, her face tight, breath short. Someone told me was our cat found on your property. Shaq nodded. In the shed. She pressed a hand to her mouth. God. She never goes back there. Shaq didn't reply. Grant showed up moments later, less shaken, more stern. Hope you're not suggesting anything, he said, voice low. Shaq looked at him. Steady. I'm not suggesting anything. Grant nodded slowly, jaw clenched. Just making sure. We take care of ours. Shaq held his gaze. So do I. That was the last they spoke for the day. That night, Shaq sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift into a bruised purple. The air felt heavier than usual, like the house itself was breathing differently. Behind him, the lemon tree rustled, leaves whispering secrets to the wind. He didn't need confrontation. That was never his way. But he wasn't blind. He saw what was happening. Willow Ridge had mastered the art of the unspoken war, battles fought in glances, comments, gestures, omissions, and Shaq, for all his size and fame, had become the quiet target of a neighborhood that wasn't used to change with roots. But he wasn't leaving. The tools, the paint, the cat, they weren't warnings. They were invitations to engage, to respond, to break. And Shaq had learned long ago that silence, when chosen, was louder than anger. He reached for his phone, opened the Notes app, and began writing a list, not of tools to replace, but of things to watch. Behaviors, patterns, faces. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was preparing for truth. And truth, unlike rumors, didn't knock first. It walked right through the front door. The morning Lucille arrived in Willow Ridge. The skies were a cloudless blue, but the air felt taut, like something invisible was being stretched too far. Her visit wasn't unannounced, but she hadn't given Shaq much notice either. She didn't need to. A mother doesn't ask permission to check on her son, especially when something in her bones tells her that things aren't as calm as they seem. Lucille O'Neill was elegance wrapped in steel. She stepped out of the rideshare car with her head held high, a straw sun hat tilted at just the right angle, her eyes hidden behind wide, amber-tinted glasses that saw far more than she let on. The moment she stepped onto Shaq's porch, she didn't need to knock. He was already at the door, arms wide, grinning easy. "Mama," he said. "My baby," she replied, though he dwarfed her frame by threefold. She held his face for a second longer than usual, her palms firm on his cheeks. "You been sleeping like a log," Shaq said. She looked past him into the house.
"That's not what I asked."
He smiled, moved aside. "Come on in." The house had come alive since she last saw it. New curtains, repainted trims, floorboards, polished to a deep amber shine. Lucille took it all in with a quiet pride. He'd made this place his own, but more importantly, he'd respected its past. She ran her fingers across a framed photo on the wall. Coach Bradley and a teenage Shaq, arm draped over his shoulder, both grinning wide in a gymnasium, lost to time. "You've done good," she said, sitting down at the breakfast nook where fresh flowers sat in a mason jar. "But this place feels watched." Shaq set down 2 glasses of iced tea. "You always feel that way when you visit new places." "I feel it when people don't say what they mean," Lucille said, never looking away. "And I know the difference between curiosity and resentment." Shaq sipped his tea, watching the lemon tree sway through the kitchen window. "It's just a little coldness, Mama. They'll warm up." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Coldness doesn't smash mailboxes. It doesn't kill cats. And it sure as hell doesn't spill paint for fun." Shaq said nothing. He just leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the table. He wasn't ignoring her. He was choosing stillness, the kind that comes from years of being both target and symbol. A man in the spotlight long enough to know the cost of flinching. "They'll see me," he finally said. "I'm not just renting space here, I'm investing in it. They'll come around." Lucille didn't argue, but her silence wasn't agreement. It was a prayer held behind closed lips. The next day, Shaq posted handwritten invitations in every mailbox on the block. A neighborhood barbecue. Saturday afternoon. Hosted by yours truly. Free food. Good music. Everyone welcome. He signed it with his signature smiley face, the same one he used when autographing basketballs. He spent 2 full days preparing. The grill was wheeled onto the driveway. Tables lined with gingham cloth stretched beneath pop-up tents. Lucille helped prep the food. Ribs, wings, macaroni salad, sweet corn and peach cobbler that tasted like Sundays in the South. Shaq set up speakers and created a playlist that bounced between jazz, Motown and easy summer classics. Saturday came golden and breezy. By noon, neighbors began to trickle in. Marlene arrived first, carrying a fruit platter and overly rehearsed politeness. Then came the Crawfords, a middle-aged couple who didn't talk much but seemed content to eat and nod at the music. Soon the lawn filled with folding chairs and awkward conversations, the kind where no one knew quite how to begin. But Shaq made it easy. He laughed loud, flipped burgers with flair, and made every guest feel like the party was for them. Kids from the next block came chasing each other with bubble wands, their parents trailing behind with half apologies. Shaq handed out snow cones and complimented everyone's lawn care, even when it wasn't deserved. Still, as the afternoon stretched on, there were 2 notable absences. The Wilburns didn't show. Their absence wasn't neutral. It was loud. Their porch light was on, blinds angled just enough for someone inside to watch without being seen. Delilah's pastel curtains fluttered once, and Shaq caught the movement, but the door stayed closed. No casserole, no awkward greetings, just distance dressed in shutters. Lucille noticed too. "They ain't coming," she said, sipping lemonade beside him as the grill hissed and cracked. "They got the invite. They got a lot more than that, baby." By dusk, most guests had eaten their fill and drifted off. A few lingered, chatting about traffic, summer camps, and the rising cost of groceries. No one mentioned the Wilburns. No one needed to. Lucille helped Shaq clear the dishes and fold up chairs. As the sun dipped, the sky lit in shades of melon and fire. He stood on the porch looking out at the street that still felt like it didn't know what to make of him. But he smiled anyway. He'd made an offering, broken bread, shared space. That night he slept with the window open. At 2:43 a.m., the sound came like a shotgun blast. Metal on metal, splintering wood, screeching tires. Shaq jolted upright, heart punching hard. He threw on his robe, rushed outside barefoot. Lucille was already behind him, her voice calm but firm. Wait, don't run. On the curb, the mailbox lay mangled, bent at the base, door ripped off. Splinters of the post scattered across the lawn like teeth knocked out of a mouth. Shaq stood over it, breathing heavy. No cars in sight, no footsteps, just tire marks veering off the edge of the road. Lucille reached him slowly. She didn't speak. She just laid her hand on his back, steady and grounding. "They're done being subtle," she said. Shaq didn't reply. He crouched low, picked up the bent metal, and examined it. The screws had been ripped from the base, not just a casual strike, but a deliberate hit. It wasn't the act of a drunk driver or reckless teenager. This was a message. But Shaq didn't shout. He didn't wake the neighbors or call the police. He just gathered the broken pieces, carried them to the porch and set them down like a puzzle he intended to solve later. Inside, Lucille made a pot of tea. She didn't offer reassurances. She knew better. Instead, she sat beside him at the kitchen table. The quiet between them thick with decisions neither had said out loud yet. "You still think they'll come around?" she asked gently. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on the table. "No." Lucille nodded, sipping her tea. "But I'm not going anywhere," he added. Lucille reached out, squeezed his hand. "I didn't think you would." The next morning, he was up before sunrise, digging a new hole at the base of the driveway. He didn't replace the mailbox with anything fancy, just a plain steel box on a thick oak post, this time cemented deeper, unshakable. Marlene walked by, paused. "Oh dear, I heard something last night. I hope was it an accident?" Shaq straightened, dusted his hands. Accidents don't leave tread marks that deliberate. She gave a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, well, let me know if you need help filing a report." "I don't," he said kindly. She moved on. That afternoon, the Wilburns' car was gone. Not a word, just a vacant driveway and a house locked tight. But the tension lingered, like smoke after a fire that never quite burned out. The crack had formed, not just in the mailbox post, or the neighborhood's illusion of peace, but in something deeper, a fracture between what Willow Ridge pretended to be and what it truly was when no one was watching. And cracks, Shaq knew, could spread, or they could be filled. It was just a matter of what you poured into them. Within 2 weeks, the flyers went up. Legacy Hoops, free youth basketball program. Sponsored by Shaquille O'Neal. There were no strings attached. Equipment was provided. Meals were served. Guest coaches were brought in. Shaq showed up every weekend in shorts and a whistle, running drills and tying laces, high-fiving kids who'd only seen him on cereal boxes. The kids came, dozens at first, then hundreds. Parents followed, some skeptical, some grateful. And in that gym, that dusty court with flickering overhead lights, Shaq smiled again. Real smiles, the kind you don't fake for cameras. But Willow Ridge noticed. Flyers started disappearing from the community board near the post office. HOA meetings began to shift in tone, discussing increased traffic, noise from adjacent neighborhoods, and safety concerns. Though no names were mentioned, Shaq heard the message beneath the word. It didn't stop him. He hosted a fundraiser to buy new bleachers and brought in local vendors. He organized carpools. He even paid for college application workshops in the rec room, across the parking lot. For every slight he endured, he responded with an open hand. For every ugly look, a cleaner court. For every silent judgment, a louder act of grace. But that only made some people angrier. One morning, Shaq found a single tennis ball left on his porch. Nothing written on it, no damage, no note. Just a tennis ball. Fresh, bright, perfectly placed in the center of the welcome mat. It was odd, meaningless on the surface. But it wasn't random. No kids played tennis in that part of the neighborhood. No one jogged past his house with a racket in hand. It was a message. The kind of message that meant, we see you, we don't like it, and we know how to get close. He stared at the ball for a long time before picking it up and dropping it in the trash. That night, he rewired the cameras again, added a floodlight sensor near the garage, and adjusted the angle of the shed camera just slightly wider. Lucille called and heard the weariness in his voice. "You sound like you're waiting for something," she said. "I am," he admitted, "but I don't know what yet." She didn't tell him to rest. She didn't tell him to leave. She just said, "Be ready for them to not know how to handle your kindness. People who can't control you will always try to break what you build." Shaq looked around the house he'd restored inch by inch, the lemon tree now blooming wild near the back fence, the driveway where he'd re-cemented the mailbox post. Stronger than before. "They can't break this," he said softly. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't about the house anymore. It wasn't even about him. It was about what he represented, that someone like him could exist in a space not designed to hold him, and not just survive, but thrive. And to some people, that was unforgivable. The final crack that week came in the form of a letter, not mailed, hand-delivered, folded neatly into the crack between the screen door and the frame. It was unsigned, printed in bold font. One sentence only. "Good men don't force themselves into places they don't belong." He read it twice, then burned it in the kitchen sink. Not out of rage, but to remind himself that fire could be redirected. He carried the ashes to the back porch and let them scatter beneath the lemon tree. The roots would know what to do with them. The weekend away had been unplanned. A short, necessary escape with his daughter Mara, just the two of them, away from the buzzing tension of Willow Ridge. They'd driven down to a quiet lakefront cabin, not far from where Shaq used to go during off-seasons. It wasn't extravagant, just peace wrapped in pine and silence. Mara had begged him to unplug, even if just for a day. "No cameras, no phones, no stairs. Just us, Dad," she'd said, her teenage smile framed with sincerity only daughters can offer. And so, for 48 hours, he'd let it go. The subtle battles, the cold stares, the mailbox, the graffiti, the letter, all of it. He let it drift out across the lake, as he watched his daughters skip stones and talk about college and life and her dreams of doing more than just being Shaq's daughter. She wanted to coach. She wanted to lead. She wanted to build her name and earn her place, just like he had. And for a brief moment, as the sun fell behind the trees and their laughter echoed over water, it almost felt like the storm behind them had passed. They pulled into Willow Ridge just after noon, on Sunday. The sky was clear, but the neighborhood was quieter than usual. No kids on bikes, no dogs barking. Even the breeze seemed hesitant. Miara was in the passenger seat, nodding along to an old-school playlist when Shaq slowed the truck at the edge of Hollow Creek Lane. Something was wrong. The first thing he noticed was the porch light. It was swinging slightly off its fixture, swaying like someone had recently bumped into it. Then he saw the splinters on the edge of the front steps. Mara was mid-sentence when she stopped. Her head turned slowly, her breath caught. "Dad," she whispered. The window. The large bay window in the front of the house, once the centerpiece of the living room, was shattered. Jagged shards clung to the edges of the frame, the curtains flapping through like torn sails. Shaq stopped the truck in the middle of the street. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He parked slowly, deliberately, and got out. Neighbors watched. He could feel them. Curtains shifted. A door closed softly somewhere to the left. But no one came outside. He walked up the steps one at a time. Manara stayed close behind, her hands trembling now. The front door was still locked, but the bottom half had been kicked in, not with finesse, but with rage. Wood splintered, hinges bent. Shaq pushed it open the rest of the way, and the smell hit him first. It wasn't rot or fire, it was chaos. Drywall dust, torn fabric, wet carpet. A home gutted by hate. The living room was demolished, cushions sliced open, the coffee table overturned, picture frames shattered. Coach Bradley's photo lay face down, glass crushed beneath it. Shaq bent slowly, picked it up. His fingers shook for the first time. A long scratch ran across the coach's face, deliberate. Nira stepped into the room and gasped. Oh my God. The kitchen was worse. The faucet was still running, water pooling on the floor, trailing out into the hallway. Cabinet doors torn off their hinges. Plates smashed like bones. A chair shoved through the wall. They moved through the house like ghosts. Mimera clung to her phone, trying to get a signal. but her hands were shaking too hard to tap the screen. In the hallway, the family photos had been ripped from the walls. In the bathroom, the mirror was cracked down the center, like it had been punched. The bedrooms weren't spared. His mattress had been slashed open, drawers emptied. The closet door hung off one hinge, swinging aimlessly. In Mara's guest room, her duffel bag from the trip had been dumped and kicked across the floor. One of her notebooks, the one with her college plans and practice schedules, lay crumpled in a corner. And then came the message. Spray painted across the back wall of the hallway, bold and wet and unforgiving in its crudeness. Go back to where you belong. The red paint dripped onto the carpet like blood. Mara stood frozen, her mouth open, her voice gone. Her hand rose slowly, pointing, her fingers curling into her palm. Shaq walked past her, stood before the words. He didn't reach for them, didn't try to wipe them away. He just stood there, breathing. Long, measured inhales, then a quiet exhale. Behind him, Mara finally found her voice. They came into our house, Dad. They did this while we were gone. Shaq turned to her. She looked like she wanted to run and cry at the same time. Her fists were clenched, knuckles white. Why? She asked. Why do they hate us this much? We didn't do anything. He didn't have an answer. Not one she needed. Not now.
Lucille arrived 15 minutes later. She didn't knock. She saw the truck in the driveway. She saw the porch light still swinging. She felt it.
Shaq met her at the door. She took one look inside and froze. Her mouth tightened. Her eyes welled. But she didn't cry. Not yet. She moved through the wreckage with the stillness of someone who had seen this kind of destruction before. Different cities, different lives, but always the same sickness beneath. In the kitchen, she finally sat down on a single unbroken chair and looked at her son. You okay? She asked. Shaq didn't nod. Didn't lie. I don't know yet. They didn't call the police. Not right away. Mimera had already done it, her voice shaking on the call, giving the address, her name, listing the damages. But when the dispatcher asked if there was a suspect, she paused. Does the whole neighborhood count? She'd whispered. When the officers arrived, they were different from the ones who came for the shed graffiti. These were uniformed, young, careful. They walked through the house taking photos, notes. One of them, Detective Harmon, was more focused, more sincere. This was planned, he said after 20 minutes. This isn't random. They knew you were gone. Shaq stood quietly in the hallway, arms folded. They cut the cameras too. The detective looked up, surprised. You had security? 4 of them. All offline. Harmon nodded, jaw tight. That takes time. They knew what they were doing. Lucille stood behind him, arms crossed. And will anything come of this? We'll investigate, Harmon said carefully. But without fingerprints or footage, it'll be hard to pin down. Shaq nodded slowly. So the answer's no. The detective said nothing. Later, after the police were gone, and the neighbors had retreated back into their curtained silence, Shaq sat in the middle of the living room, on the floor. Not on the couch. There wasn't one left intact, just the floor, surrounded by broken glass and torn upholstery. The scent of malice, still fresh in the air. He didn't speak. Lucille sat beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder. Mara stayed in the hallway, her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. No one cried, not in that moment, but there was an ache in the silence louder than any sob. Outside, the sky darkened. The sun was gone now, and the house had no lights. The bulbs had been smashed too. Shaq lit one candle, just one, placed it in the center of the room. Lucille finally broke the silence. You gonna leave now? Shaq looked at her, his eyes rimmed with red but dry. No. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She nodded once, firmly. Then we rebuild. He looked around at the broken walls, the spray paint, the place where Coach Bradley's photo used to hang, and he said no. We don't just rebuild. He stood slowly, the candlelight flickering across his face. We show them what rising looks like. This was about truth, and the truth had a way of showing itself. If you were patient enough. The moving truck stayed parked for 6 hours. Enough time to let the story take root. Enough time for whispers to grow wings. By early evening, a few neighbors even dared to offer small talk as they passed. Heading somewhere new, one asked, casual like he wasn't invested. Taking a break? Another said with a tilt of the head. Shaq just smiled. A quiet, unreadable smile. The kind that didn't invite more questions. At 5:37 p.m., he opened the back door of the truck for the first time. Empty. Not a single box. Not a single item. Just a wide, hollow space, as clean as the day it was manufactured. No dust. No tape. No intention of leaving. The Wilburns watched. Delilah's glass paused halfway to her lips. "Where's the furniture?" she asked. Grant sat forward, squinting. They waited. But nothing happened. No movers came. No items packed. Just Shaq standing at the open bay of the truck, staring down the street like he was waiting for a cue. That cue came in the form of a white SUV pulling up across the road. A man in a navy windbreaker stepped out, camera bag over shoulder, ID badge clipped to his collar. Behind him, another stepped out. Then a woman, all carrying lenses and mics and smiles that weren't meant for pleasantries. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a circus. It was a documentation. Shaq welcomed them inside. Quietly, no one was announced. No spectacle. Just entry. The cameras weren't rolling yet. Not yet. He gave them the lay of the house. The damage still visible. The photo of Coach Bradley, still framed. The message that once bled from the hallway wall, now painted over, but its ghost still lingering in the paint beneath. Then he took them to the kitchen. On the table, a laptop, connected to a monitor. One click, and the screen flickered to life. Footage played in silence, date stamped, clear as day. A shadow slipping through the fence line. Another camera caught the side alley, figures in hoodies, flashlights cut low, gloves visible. The feed wasn't choppy, it was crystal. One camera caught the faces, paused on frame. Shaq didn't name them. He didn't need to. The man in the footage had a limp, the same one Grant Wilburn had after a skiing accident last year, visible even from the porch he now sat on, sipping his final glass of wine. The other, smaller build, swift, careful, had a long red braid trailing from beneath the hood. Delilah. The press team didn't react loudly. They took notes. They asked quiet, precise questions. "When did you install the new cameras? Why didn't you come forward sooner? Was this about vengeance?" Shaq answered only once. "It's not about revenge. It's about light. Some people don't like what's seen when you turn it on." By nightfall, the truck was gone. Shaq hadn't packed a thing. The truck had never been for moving. It had been a mirror parked in the center of the street, to show people what they thought they wanted. And now they had it. The next morning, the video leaked online.
Not from Shaq.
From a reporter who'd seen enough to know this wasn't just about a house. It was about legacy. And when the footage hit the internet, it didn't take long for people to start naming names. Willow Ridge went silent. The Wilburns did not toast again that weekend. And Shaq? He sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea beside Lucille, the sun warming his face. Miara stood on the sidewalk, chalk in hand, sketching patterns across the cement circles that spiraled inward until they reached a steady point in the center. The kind of calm that comes after a storm reveals who never planned to shelter you. The flyers went out on a Wednesday morning, tastefully printed, folded in thirds, and slipped into every mailbox on Hollow Creek Lane, hand-delivered by Mara and Lucille. Bold cursive across the top read, "One final evening, with gratitude." The subheading was smaller. "Join us for a farewell celebration with food, stories, and thanks. No drama, no bitterness, just enough ambiguity to keep the whispers circling." Shaq didn't attach a note. He didn't need to. By Friday, the questions started. Is he really leaving? Where's he going? Maybe he's finally had enough. The neighborhood hummed with quiet speculation. Some residents spoke with relief. Others, those who had grown used to his quiet dignity and the security of his presence, felt something closer to guilt. Either way, people RSVP'd without hesitation. Curiosity always had more pull than kindness. Saturday arrived golden and crisp. The kind of spring afternoon that coaxed people from their porches and into their Sunday best, a day early. The front lawn of Shaq's house had been transformed. Round tables with linen cloths, string lights strung from tree to tree, a long buffet table lined with silver trays under warmers. No grand banners, no spotlight, just elegance and intention. A jazz trio played under the shade of the lemon tree. Their notes fluttered like dragonflies over the murmuring crowd. The smell of slow-roasted barbecue and peach cobbler drifted through the air, laced with fresh-baked cornbread, and sweet tea poured from glass pitchers, beaded with condensation. Shaq didn't emerge right away. He let the gathering breathe. Neighbors arrived dressed casually but presentably. A few newcomers mingled nervously, unsure how much warmth to offer. Others, longtime residents of Willow Ridge, wore guarded expressions, their smiles brittle. They moved through the yard like performers unsure of their lines, but still, they came. And so did the Wilburns. Grant wore a navy blazer and pressed khakis, his gold watch gleaming every time he adjusted his sleeve. Delilah walked beside him in a powder blue dress, and heels too tall for grass. Her smile never quite settled on her face, but she nodded and offered hellos with calculated poise. They found a table near the center, perfectly visible but not too close to the front. They didn't speak to Shaq. Not yet. They didn't need to. Just before sunset, as golden light spilled like honey across the lawn, Shaq finally stepped out. He wore all black simple slacks, button-up shirt, no tie. His presence was quiet but powerful. A man who no longer needed height to command a room. His walk was unhurried. He greeted each table with a nod or a handshake, stopping briefly for Mara, who hugged him tight before joining the trio under the tree with Lucille. He stepped up onto the small wooden platform that had been used during his block BBQ weeks ago. But this time, it bore a single microphone and nothing else. The music faded, and conversation softened like air, leaving a room. Shaq looked out at them all. Neighbors, bystanders, spectators. The same people who once crossed the street, rather than greet him, now leaned forward, waiting. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I want to thank each of you for being here tonight. I didn't throw this gathering to say goodbye to a house or a street. I threw it to say goodbye to something else." He let that hang for a second. "I've lived a big life, bigger than I ever thought possible. Played ball in cities I couldn't pronounce, stood on stages I never imagined. But what's always meant the most to me is the small things, the quiet places, the people you build a life next to, the ones you share fences and mailboxes with." He looked toward the far end of the crowd. The Wilburns stared back, unreadable. "I moved here because this house mattered to me, not for its square footage, or what it could be flipped for, but because of what it meant. My coach lived here, a man who believed in building boys into men before winning trophies. This house taught me how to breathe again after years of being on the move." The crowd listened, silent. Some arms crossed, others hands clasped. And I thought, maybe if I just showed up as myself, as a neighbor, I could be part of something. I could invest, not just in property but in people. He paused. "And many of you gave me that chance. For that, I thank you." A few heads dipped, a few shoulders shifted. "But some of you didn't." The stillness sharpened. "Some of you saw me not as a man, but as a threat, as a disruption, as a reminder of something you'd rather forget." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote. Clicked once. The large white sheet strung behind him, once appearing decorative, dropped behind it. A projection screen lit up. The first video played without sound. Surveillance footage. Night vision. Grainy but clear. Two people moving across his side yard. Flashlights flickering. Hoods up. Another video. A close-up from the bird feeder cam. Someone kneeling beside the spray-painted shed wall, hands shaking slightly, as they drew letters in red. A third clip, from the mailbox. A figure with a limp kicking the post over, pausing, then running back toward a parked SUV. The plate was blurred, but the profile wasn't. The screen flickered once more. Now, audio. A voice. Low, angry, unmistakably Grant's. "He's not going to leave unless we push him out. Let's remind him who built this place." A beat. Then another voice. Delilah's, sharper, quieter. "We can't get caught. Do it clean. Just make him feel unwanted." The crowd's breath drew in, all at once. Grant stood slowly. This is manipulated. You can't." Shaq raised a hand calmly. "I didn't press charges. Not yet. I didn't run this through lawyers or post it on the internet. I wanted you to hear it here first. Among your neighbors. Among people who might have stood by, unsure of what really happened." Grant's jaw twitched. Delilah's face had gone pale. Shaq stepped down from the platform. "I don't want revenge. I'm not moving. I'm not hiding. But I am done pretending." He looked across the lawn, letting his eyes meet each pair he could. "This neighborhood isn't what it says it is. Not yet. But it could be. It could be more than whispers and fences and polite silence. It could be a place where people see each other." Lucille nodded from the side, her chin proud, eyes glassy. Mara clapped once. Then again, slowly. Others followed. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough. Shaq turned away from the mic and walked back toward the table where his family sat. The screen behind him faded to black. The trio began to play again, soft notes of brass and brush. And for the first time, it was the Wilburns who left early. Not in anger, but in silence. As the sun disappeared and candles flickered on each table, conversation resumed. But now it was real. People leaned in. Apologies floated in the air, tentative but present. Some folks offered help. Others asked questions they'd been too afraid or too proud to ask before. Shaq didn't try to fix anyone. He just stayed. And sometimes, staying speaks louder than leaving ever could. Shaq moved forward regardless. He launched Project Groundwork with local organizers. The plan was to renovate an abandoned rec center on the edge of town, transform it into a safe space with basketball courts, computer labs, mentorship rooms, and an outdoor community garden. The city had offered partial funding. Shaq covered the rest quietly. No ribbon cutting, no media stunts. He just showed up with his sleeves rolled and his clipboard in hand. Volunteers joined. Teachers, coaches, parents, even teenagers. Shaq worked shoulder to shoulder with them, lifting drywall, planting soil, ordering food for every shift. His smile returned. His purpose expanded. The more he built, the less the Wilburns' silence mattered, until it didn't matter at all. But sometimes guilt has its own clock. Delilah showed up first. She didn't come to the work site. She came to the house. Lucille answered the door. Delilah looked different. Her eyes were bare, face stripped of makeup, her posture uncertain. "I came to speak to him," she said softly. Lucille studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. Shaq was in the backyard, tending to the lemon tree. Delilah approached slowly. He didn't turn, but he knew it was her. "I read your letter," she said. He nodded once. "I didn't respond because I didn't think it was real. I thought maybe you were trying to ruin us without saying it out loud." He remained silent. "But then I saw what you were building, what you're doing with that rec center. And I knew you weren't just trying to make a point. You were trying to make peace." He finally turned. "I'm not interested in peace for the sake of silence," he said. "I'm interested in truth. Real peace doesn't come without that." Delilah nodded, her eyes glassing over. "We were wrong, not just in what we did, but in what we thought, about you, about who gets to belong." Shaq didn't soften. He didn't need to, but he didn't harden either. "And Grant?" he asked. She hesitated. "He's not ready to talk, but I am." He nodded once more. "Then show up. Not here, at the rec center. Not for me, for the kids, for the people you never thought you'd need to apologize to." She left quietly. The next day she showed up.
No fanfare, no makeup, just jeans, gloves, and a bucket of paint.
She worked with the teens repainting the eastern wall of the gym.
No one pointed, no one mocked.
Shaq made sure of it. A few days later, Grant came. He didn't speak to anyone for hours. Just hauled lumber, fixed fixtures, and kept his eyes low. But on day 3, he stood at the front of the gym with a hammer in hand, and finally approached Shaq. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. Shaq looked up from his clipboard. "I don't expect you to ask for it." Grant nodded. "Then I'll keep showing up. That's all I can do." "That's all you should do," Shaq replied. The Wilburns never fully reclaimed their social standing in Willow Ridge. But over time, something shifted. They stopped pretending. They started working. They became quiet, useful, present. And presence, Shaq knew, was the only real apology that mattered. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that felt caught between seasons. Sunlight warm, but a chill in the breeze that hinted at something changing underneath. The town was quieter than usual, not because people were away, but because most eyes were fixed on screens. The local news had teased the segment since dawn. Exclusive, Wilburn family speaks out after controversial footage goes viral. No one said it directly, but everyone knew what was coming. It wasn't just an apology, it was reckoning. Long delayed, now dragging itself into daylight. Cameras had been set up in the local community center's auditorium, the same building being renovated for Project Groundwork. Rows of folding chairs stretched in straight lines, a podium near center stage, flanked by 2 flags, the American flag and the Georgia state flag. Shaq sat quietly in the front row. No entourage, no spotlight, just him and Lucille, who dressed in her Sunday best, not out of celebration, but respect. Mira sat beside them, her notebook in her lap, scribbling quietly. This wasn't a moment for outrage. It was a moment for truth to finally speak louder than what had been whispered behind fences. The room filled slowly. Not packed, but enough. Local press stood near the back, their equipment silent and waiting. A few community leaders, volunteers from the rec center, kids from the basketball clinic seated near the side aisles, unsure why they were there but sensing the gravity of it anyway. Then Delilah walked in. No pearls, no curated smile, no pastel-colored power suit. Just a simple black blouse, hair pulled back, eyes dark with sleeplessness. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the podium. Behind her, Grant followed. Slower, stiffer, his jaw set in that same stoic posture he'd once used to dismiss Shaq from the other side of a driveway. But now he wasn't behind a fence. He was on stage. Vulnerable. Seen. Delilah took a breath. One that echoed in the microphone. "I don't expect this to be enough," she began, her voice steady but raw. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just came here to speak the truth."
No papers. No cue cards.
She looked out at the audience, pausing when her eyes met Shaq's. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. For months we justified our actions with stories we told ourselves. Stories about keeping things safe, about keeping our neighborhood intact. We convinced ourselves that disruption meant danger, that difference meant risk, and because of that, we hurt someone who did nothing but try to live beside us with grace. Her voice cracked at the end, and she reached for the podium with both hands. "I spray painted a wall. I lied to police. I turned fear into action, and that action into hate." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. "I watched my husband destroy a man's property, and said nothing. I watched my daughter ask why the nice man across the street stopped smiling, and I told her he was just busy." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I let silence be my weapon, and I'm ashamed." She stepped back from the mic, wiping her face. Grant moved forward, his steps heavier. He adjusted the mic once, but didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was low, reluctant, but real. "I didn't grow up around men like Shaquille," he said. "I grew up in rooms where men like him were used as examples of what not to be, of what wasn't welcome. I carried that with me for years. I never questioned it." He paused, jaw tightening. But then he moved across the street, and I was faced with something I couldn't stereotype from afar anymore. I saw kindness, and I labeled it arrogance. I saw a quiet man, an assumed threat. He looked toward the back of the room for a second, like he was searching for a version of himself that made more sense than the one standing there now. I vandalized his home. I cut his cameras. I planned it. And when I saw his face the next morning, I felt nothing but pride. That's what I'm ashamed of most. He turned toward Shaq now, directly. "You didn't deserve any of it, and I don't deserve your grace." Shaq didn't move. Delilah stepped beside her husband again, not touching him but standing close enough that they were no longer separate in this. The news cameras zoomed in slightly. Someone in the back coughed. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was hollow, waiting to be filled. Shaq stood slowly. He didn't walk to the stage. He didn't take the mic. He simply stepped forward until he was standing at the edge of the first row, eyes level with the couple. "I'm not here because I want to see you punished," he said, voice even. "I'm here because I've lost things too, and I know what it means to live with the weight of regret." The words hit the room like slow thunder. "My house was never just a house. You didn't just break walls. You tried to erase history. Mine, Coach Bradley's, everyone who ever believed that a black man could live in peace beside you." Delilah looked down, lips trembling. "But I'm not here to bury you. I'm here to invite you." He stepped back now, so the entire room could see him. "You said you wanted to make this right, so here's how you do it. Not with microphones. Not with confessions." He gestured toward a large easel near the side of the stage. "A blueprint. The final rendering of Project Groundwork. We're building this center for kids who have nowhere to go after school. For kids who don't see themselves in the mirror of this town. And I want you both there. Not in the background, right in the dirt, hands covered in paint and soil. I want you to help build what you tried to tear down." Gasps moved through the room, but no one spoke against him. Delilah nodded slowly, her tears returning. Grant gave a quiet, trembling exhale. "Okay," he said. "We will." Shaq gave a single nod. Then we moved forward. The cameras caught it all. The headlines ran the next day. Forgiveness is louder. O'Neill's grace turns hate into action. But for the people in that room, it wasn't about headlines. It was about a weight, finally lifted. A moment when loss gave way to something more useful. Later that evening, the rec center's parking lot filled with volunteers. Not reporters, not spectators, just people. And among them, Grant handed out paintbrushes. Delilah helped a group of kids dig holes for new tree saplings. Shaq stood back, arms folded, eyes scanning the worksite. Myra nudged him gently. "You sure you're okay with them being here?" she asked. Shaq nodded. "They chose to show up. That's more than most ever do." Lucille joined them, wrapping her arm around his waist. "That's not just forgiveness, baby. That's leadership." The hammering, the laughter, the scraping of paint, all of it filled the air like music. And as the sun lowered behind the trees, the old building began to breathe again. Walls freshly colored, roots sinking deeper. Shaq didn't need a podium anymore. He had something better. He had proof. It was a late afternoon in early fall when the final wall was finished. The outer west-facing side of the house, the same wall that once held the words "Go back to where you belong," now bore a mural. Local artist, volunteer time, collective effort. The background was deep navy, the color of dusk. Across it stretched a tree, its trunk wide and solid, branches reaching out like arms. Instead of leaves, the tree held portraits, soft silhouettes of different faces, young and old, light and dark, smiling and silent. Some were real, some imagined, all human. Beneath the tree, in large white script, it read, "Love builds what hate can't break." No signature, no date, just message. That evening, Shaq sat under the porch light, the soft hum of insects in the air, the smell of Lucille's fresh lavender wafting from the flower beds. He watched as a moving truck pulled into the driveway next door. He didn't rise, didn't need to. A young couple stepped out first, the man tall, caramel-skinned with shoulder-length locks, the woman dark-haired and freckled, laughter in her eyes even as she looked exhausted from the drive. They opened the back door and unbuckled a toddler, curly-haired, bouncing with energy, holding a stuffed lion with one missing eye. A moment later, a second car pulled in behind them, the woman's mother and her sister, carrying boxes, smiling, waving to Shaq. They didn't glance around cautiously. They didn't hesitate. Nobody cared what they looked like. They belonged. Mira stepped out to the porch handing her father a glass of cold sweet tea. She followed his gaze to the new neighbors and smiled. "Think they'll last?" Shaq chuckled low. Took a sip. "If the lawn doesn't scare them off, they'll be just fine." She sat beside him. The porch light flickered on, soft and golden. Across the street, someone turned on a radio. Jazz drifted faintly through the air. A few kids still played in the distance, the light fading but the laughter lingering. Lucille joined them, settling into the rocking chair. She glanced toward the mural. "That's the kind of thing they'll remember," she said, nodding toward the tree on the wall. Shaq didn't reply right away. He looked out across the street, at the homes that once watched him with suspicion, now quiet in their reckoning. "I didn't move here to be a symbol," he said. "I just wanted to remember a man who gave me a shot." "And you did," Lucille replied. "You remembered him the best way anyone could, by giving someone else a shot." The porch creaked beneath them, as the evening settled. In the mentorship room inside, the lights were still on. A small group of boys sat around the table, watching highlights of old games on a laptop. Mira had left it on loop. One of the boys pointed at the screen, eyes wide. "Yo, he was huge." Another leaned in. "That's him. The guy next door." "Man," one of them said, "why is he not on TV anymore?" The oldest kid smiled. "He's doing more than TV." They didn't hear what was said on the porch. They didn't need to. They lived in what had been built. And in that quiet space, where the broken had been rebuilt, where a house had become a home for more than one family, where old wounds were being painted over with color and care, the story found its final chapter. Not in noise, not in courtroom battles or angry confrontations, but in the whisper of a tree painted on a wall, and the words that danced beneath it. Love builds what hate can't break. Sometimes, the loudest revenge is a whisper of grace. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Sit with it. Share it. Talk about it at your table, your team, your town hall. Because what happened on Hollow Creek Lane happens in more places than we admit. And sometimes the loudest change begins with the quiet choice to care. Not just once, but again and again.